Hello and welcome to this news live from Islamabad. I'm GOVT and these are the headlines. Pakistan's Prime Minister Imran Khan has criticized the Western media for highlighting the Uyghur situation but neglecting human rights violations in occupied Kashmir. He was speaking to Chinese journalists as Beijing marks the centenary of the ruling Communist Party. The Prime Minister reiterated the ties between Pakistan and China will not be affected by any sort of pressure. Pakistan has called on the international community to take note of the plight of oppressed children in Indian-occupied Kashmir. In a statement, the Foreign Office welcomed a UN report highlighting the targeting of civilians with pellet guns. Islamabad strongly condemned the denial of the right to self-determination of Kashmiris. Germany says there is no alternative to the two-state solution for the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. German President Frank-Walter Steinmeier said this during a meeting with his Israeli counterpart Reuven Rivlin in Jerusalem. In Myanmar, hundreds of protesters took to the streets in Yangon calling for the restoration of democracy 5 months after a military coup. The protest against the military crackdown was one of the biggest in the city in recent weeks. According to an activist group, the military has killed more than 880 people since it seized power on the 1st of February. Russia has reported a record 672 coronavirus deaths for the third day in a row. Meanwhile, World Health Organization says COVID cases in Europe have again increased after 10 weeks of decline. In Pakistan, the virus has claimed 40 more lives and infected over 1,000 people in the past 24 hours. Globally, there are 3.9 million deaths and more than 182 million cases. Those were the headlines and detailed stories right after a short break. Stay tuned. Welcome back, and now for the news in detail. Pakistan's Prime Minister Imran Khan has criticized the Western media for highlighting the Uyghur situation but neglecting human rights violations in occupied Kashmir. He was speaking to Chinese journalists as Beijing marks the centenary of the ruling Communist Party. The Prime Minister said Islamabad accepts Beijing's version regarding the treatment of Uyghur Muslims in China's Xinjiang province. Highlighting Pakistan's strong ties with China, he said Beijing has always stood by Islamabad in difficult times. Khan said Islamabad's ties with Beijing will not change despite any amount of pressure. He added that India will reap far greater benefits by engaging in trade with China rather than trying to act as a counterbalance. On Afghanistan, Khan said Pakistan is worried about the possibility of a civil war after the withdrawal of foreign forces. Pakistan has called on the international community to take note of the plight of oppressed children in Indian-occupied Kashmir. In a statement, a Foreign Office spokesperson welcomed a UN report highlighting the targeting of civilians with pellet guns. Zahid Hafiz Chaudhry said the only viable option is the solution of the Kashmir dispute as per the UN Security Council resolutions. He said any steps that are aimed at bringing further change in the occupied valley will not be accepted by locals. Pakistan has repeatedly condemned the denial of the right to self-determination of Kashmiris. The Afghan government says its troops have thwarted a massive Taliban attack aimed at capturing the Ghorian district in Herat. The provincial governor said the Taliban gathered from different parts of the western province to attack the district. He said 20 fighters were killed during the clashes. The governor added security forces also neutralized a suicide car bomber before reaching the target. Afghan forces also claimed to have retaken control of Shinwari district in Parwan. Meanwhile, the Taliban say they have captured an Afghan military base in the Saidabad district of Maidan. Russia says some parties to the Iran nuclear talks need more time before resuming negotiations in Vienna. Russia's UN envoy Mikhail Ulyanov said a new round is unlikely before next week. Earlier, Iran's UN envoy said the US must guarantee that it will not unilaterally leave the deal again. The high-level talks are underway in Vienna to revive the deal from which Washington pulled out in 2018. The Arab coalition has destroyed an explosive-laden drone launched by Yemen's Houthi rebels towards southern Saudi Arabia. In a statement, the coalition said Houthis have systematically targeted civilian properties. Earlier, Yemen's army said it shot down 2 Houthi drones over the Marib city. Houthis have intensified their attacks on the oil-rich province of Marib since February. Germany says there is no alternative to the two-state solution for the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. German President Frank-Walter Steinmeier said this during a meeting with his Israeli counterpart Reuven Rivlin in Jerusalem. Steinmeier said Iran must be prevented from acquiring nuclear weapons. The German presidency said Steinmeier will hold talks with the new Israeli Prime Minister Naftali Bennett. It said he will also meet alternate Prime Minister and Foreign Minister Yair Lapid. In Myanmar, hundreds of protesters took to the streets in Yangon, calling for the restoration of democracy 5 months after a military coup. The protesters raised slogans against the military and set fire to an army uniform. The demonstration was one of the biggest in the city in recent weeks. This comes a day after the military released over 2,000 detainees and dropped charges against celebrities who took part in anti-coup protests. According to an activist group, the military has killed more than 880 people and detained over 6,000 people since it seized power. North Korea has vowed to boost relations with China. Supreme Leader Kim Jong-un says he wishes to take bilateral ties to a new strategic point. Kim sent a message to China's President Xi Jinping on the 100th anniversary of the Chinese Communist Party. He said that strengthening ties is a need of the hour and desired by the people of both states. Kim said the pressure of hostile forces on the CPC is ineffective and can never undo China's progress. China's President Xi Jinping has warned against anyone trying to oppress or bully his country. Xi was addressing a ceremony to mark 100 years of the Chinese Communist Party. Celebrations at the Tiananmen Square saw massive crowds with military jets fly past, cannon salutes and patriotic songs. The Chinese president said Beijing has never oppressed another country, nor will it ever do so. He pledged to complete the reunification with Taiwan and to smash any attempts at formal independence for the island. Xi Jinping highlighted the role of the party in modern China and its central role in the country's growth.
100年前
100 years ago, the pioneers of communism in China established the Communist Party of China and developed the great founding spirit of the party, which is comprised of the following principles: upholding truth and ideals, staying true to our original aspiration, take on the historical mission, fighting bravely without fear of sacrifice, and remaining loyal to the party and faithful to the people. This spirit is the party's source of strength.
The Russian Navy has carried out live fighting exercises in the Black Sea. The move comes amid ongoing Sea Breeze 21 exercises in the sea led by Ukraine, the US and NATO. In a statement, the Russian Navy said the crews of 2 large landing ships had fired at sea and air targets. Meanwhile, the Russian Defense Ministry says it is tracking an Italian Navy frigate that entered the Black Sea. The drill came 2 days after Russia tested its air defense systems in Crimea. Moscow had called for the exercise to be cancelled and said It will react to safeguard national security if necessary. In Canada, remains of 182 more Indigenous children have been found at a former boarding school in British Columbia. This is the third such discovery in Canada in recent weeks. An Indigenous group, the Lower Kootenay Band, says the children were aged between 7 and 15. The group said it is believed that the remains belong to the bands of the Tunaksha Nation and other First Nation people. The Lower Kootenay Band says it is too early to decide if these were former students of the school. Indigenous leaders say they believe more graves will be found as investigation into the sites of these schools continue. In Canada, nearly 500 people have died due to record-breaking heat over the last 5 days in British Columbia. The state's chief coroner, Lisa Lapointe, says the death toll may rise. British Columbia's Lytton town broke Canada's hottest temperature record 3 times this week, hitting 49.6 degrees Celsius. Meanwhile, in the northwest U.S., temperatures in Washington and Oregon soared well above 38 degrees Celsius over the weekend. Oregon reported 63 deaths linked to the heat wave. Its governor, Kate Brown, has also declared a state of emergency due to the imminent threat of wildfires. In Haiti, at least 15 people have been killed in a shootout in the capital Port-au-Prince. The national police chief says a journalist and a political activist were among those killed. He accused allies of Phantom 509, a group of rebel police officers, for the shootout, but did not provide any evidence. The chief said the shootings occurred just hours after a group member was slain in that same area. He said the police cannot tolerate these acts of reprisal in any form. Officials say the incident is still under investigation. Meanwhile, the U.S. has condemned the violence and urged Haiti to counter the increase in gang violence. In Nigeria, unidentified gunmen have killed a Zamfara state lawmaker in a rural area. Officials said Ahmed was driving from the state capital Gusau to the city of Kano. Meanwhile, a state governor's convoy also came under fire in a separate incident that left 3 police officers injured. The situation in northwestern Nigeria has worsened, with hundreds of children abducted from schools this year for ransom. In Ethiopia, rebels claim to have forced the government troops to leave Tigray's capital, Mekelle. Earlier, Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed said troops left the city because it was no longer the center of gravity for conflicts. A spokesperson for the Tigray People's Liberation Front termed Ahmed's comment a lie. He said the TPLF fighters bested security forces in what they called their own game. The spokesperson also said government-allied Eritrean troops have not withdrawn from the region. Earlier, a government official said the troops could return to Mekelle in weeks if needed. He also said Eritrean forces, which have been accused of abuses against civilians, had withdrawn from the region. More stories to follow, but right after a short break. Stay tuned. Welcome back. Brazil has registered over 2,000 coronavirus-related deaths and more than 43,000 cases overnight. Globally, the virus has claimed more than 3.9 million lives and infected over 182 million. More in this report.
Experts warn that the highly transmissible Delta variant is threatening progress made by the U.S. in fighting COVID-19. President Joe Biden has come up well short in his goal of delivering 80 million doses to the rest of the world by the end of June. Meanwhile, the Pan American Health Organization warns that the end of the pandemic is distant in most of Latin America and the Caribbean. In Brazil, far-right President Jair Bolsonaro said the Senate Commission investigating his conduct during the pandemic cannot touch him. But hundreds of Brazilians took to the streets to call for Bolsonaro's impeachment over what they call his genocidal pandemic policies.
That's a dollar that Bolsonaro and the Ministry of Health wanted to earn on each vaccine bought, on the life of every Brazilian. We have more than 500,000 COVID-19 deaths in our country, and it is the result of the genocidal policy which revitalized the strength of coronavirus in our country.
Over in Asia, Thailand is reopening the holiday hotspot of Phuket to tourists quarantine-free, even as the country registered its highest daily death toll from COVID-19. Meanwhile, the Indonesian president has announced tougher social restrictions from July 3rd to 20th to stem a worrying spike. In Australia, significant numbers of new cases are being detected in New South Wales. The rising toll has raised fears of fresh clusters as the state reported a rise in new infections for a third straight day.
Yesterday at 8 p.m, New South Wales had 24 cases of local community transmission. Half of those were cases that were exposed in the community. A number of those cases were people who were conducting work in the last few days, some with symptoms, and we can't continue to have that happen.
The World Bank says it will up funding for COVID-19 vaccine purchases and deployment to $20 billion. South Korea has also unveiled a supplementary budget of over $29 billion to offer pandemic relief to households, aid small businesses and create jobs.
In Pakistan, 40 more people have lost their lives to COVID-19 in the last 24 hours. The Health Ministry says the death toll has crossed 22,000. The ministry said more than 1,000 people tested positive for the virus overnight. It said the caseload has exceeded 958,000, while over 904,000 have recovered. There are nearly 32,000 active cases in the country, out of which over 1,800 are critical. Meanwhile, nearly 160 million doses of COVID-19 vaccine have been administered. Health Ministry data shows that more than 3 million people have been fully vaccinated. Pakistan and India have exchanged a list of prisoners under a 2008 agreement on consular access. A list of 609 Indian prisoners were handed over to the Indian High Commission in Islamabad, out of which 558 are fishermen. Simultaneously, Indian authorities shared the list of 345 Pakistani prisoners. Under the bilateral pact, the two sides are required to exchange lists of the prisoners in January and July. The Pakistan Army has inducted the first batch of the state-of-the-art VT-4 tanks. According to the military's media wing, Commander Mangla Kaur visited the armored division and inspected the tanks. Lieutenant General Shaheen Mazhar Mahmood also witnessed the mobility and maneuverability test of the tanks. Produced by a Chinese state-owned armored vehicle manufacturer, the delivery of VT-4 tanks began in April last year. Pakistan is the third country to have bought these tanks from China after Thailand and Nigeria. In the U.S., the death toll from a residential building collapse near Miami has risen to 18. 6 more bodies, including 2 children, were found overnight in the shattered ruins of the tower. The mayor of the Miami-Dade County, Daniela Levine Cava, said 147 people are still unaccounted for. Cava added that she would convene a grand jury to examine building safety. Nobody has been pulled alive from the debris since the condo came down on June the 24th. Officials say they still hope to find survivors. Investigators have not yet concluded what caused the collapse.
I've been a trauma surgeon for around 11 years, and this has been emotionally the most difficult thing I ever had to endure. I think a lot of us, including myself, a lot of our task force members who I work with are separated from these missing people by only 1 or 2 degrees.
Former U.S. President Donald Trump's chief financial officer, Allen Weisselberg, has surrendered to authorities to face criminal charges. This comes a day after a special grand jury in New York voted to indict Trump's firm and its CFO. The charges are expected to focus on whether Weisselberg received perks without reporting them on his tax returns. In a statement, his lawyers said the top executive will plead not guilty and aims to fight the charges in the court. The Trump organization said prosecutors were using Weisselberg as a pawn to harm the former president. Trump himself is not expected to be charged this week, but prosecutors say their probe into his company is continuing. The two-time U.S. Defense Secretary Donald Rumsfeld has died at the age of 88. He was widely considered the main architect of the Iraq War. Rumsfeld's family made the announcement in a statement. He served under President George W. Bush as a key proponent of the so-called war on terror after the 9/11 attacks. He warned of the dangers of Iraqi weapons of mass destruction, but no such weapons were ever discovered. Russian President Vladimir Putin has signed a law that forces foreign social media giants to open offices in the country. Authorities say the law applies to internet giants with a daily audience in Russia of at least 500,000 people. The firms will now have to register a personal account on the website of the Russia's state communications regulator. The law is the latest move by Moscow to exert greater control over the big tech. Russia is taking action against social media companies that have failed to delete content Moscow deems illegal. Facebook, Google, Telegram, and Twitter all have court hearings scheduled for later this month with new charges. In Sudan, hundreds took to the streets to demand the transitional government's resignation over the economic reforms. The reforms, backed by the International Monetary Fund, slashed subsidies on petrol and diesel, more than doubling their price. Protesters amassed outside the presidential palace in Khartoum and rejected the IMF-led policies. Earlier, the IMF approved a $2.5 billion loan and debt relief deal with Sudan. Meanwhile, Sudanese authorities said they arrested around 200 members of the former ruling party. Officials accused them of plotting acts of destruction. Kuwait has launched its first indigenously built artificial Earth satellite into space. In a statement, the orbital space company chief said the satellite weighs 1 kilogram with a volume of 10 cubic centimeters. He said the Qamar al-Kuwait is considered as an educational satellite with micro or nanometric dimensions. The chief added the launch was carried out on a Falcon 9 vehicle from the site at Cape Canaveral. The orbital space company is the Arab world's first nanosatellites launch company. Britain-based tech company OneWeb has sent 36 satellites into orbit in a landmark launch to pave the way for a commercial internet service this year. The satellites were blasted into orbit by a Soyuz rocket from Russia's Vostochny Cosmodrome. The company listed several countries from Northern Europe, Americas, and Arctic seas as areas that should be offered full connectivity. OneWeb said a commercial service should be rolled out by the end of 2021, with a global service following next year. It said service demonstrations will begin in several key locations this summer. The company already has more than 200 satellites in orbit as part of push to provide a global internet service. The mission was the 8th OneWeb launch since the first satellites went up in 2019. It's time for a short break. We'll be back with more stories. Stay tuned. Welcome back. A prototype of a flying car completed its first intercity flight between two Slovak airports.
The air car took off from Nitra Airport in western Slovakia and landed 35 minutes later in the capital, Bratislava. The prototype can transform itself from a road vehicle to a plane in 3 minutes by extending its foldable wings and retractable tail. Clean Vision, the company that developed the prototype, said it was the car's 142-second successful landing. The company said that Air Car has completed over 40 hours of test flights so far. The car has flown at 2,500 meters and reached a maximum cruising speed of 190 kilometers per hour. Air Car's second prototype is expected to reach a cruise speed of 300 kilometers.
People all over the world are paying tribute to Princess Diana on what would have been her 60th birthday. Diana's sons, Prince William and Prince Harry, unveiled a statue of their mother in Kensington Garden. More in this report.
When I started my public life 12 years ago, I understood the media might be interested in what I did, but I was not aware of how overwhelming that attention would become.
As one of the most famous women of all time, Diana, Princess of Wales, was a global icon. Known as the People's Princess, the much-missed royal continues to be an inspiration more than 2 decades after her death. As Princess of Wales, Diana devoted herself to charity work. She was seen as bridging the divide between the monarchy and the public. Now, on her birthday, Prince William and Harry put their differences aside to unveil Diana's statue. In a joint tribute, the royal brothers hope that the statue will be seen forever as a symbol of their mother's life and legacy.
And other business updates, the Wall Street stocks have risen as investors gear up for their second quarterly earnings. Initial claims for state jobless benefits dropped to 364,000, the lowest since March. Moreover, the US dollar also hit its highest mark since April. The indices of S&P 500 and DJI traded 0.25% higher, but Nasdaq Composite traded down. Meanwhile, the oil prices surged to a near 3-year high ahead of a decision from key producers on production policy. And now the weather situation from around the globe. And that is all for now. For the latest updates, you can follow us on social media at Indus News.